Well, hey guys, thanks for having me out. So Nathan here asked me to come and do a little dev talk on seismic. So first off, I'm Darren Richards. I currently work at ServiceNow, and was originally one of the original developers on seismic framework, which is in the customer land UX experience framework. So that was a marketing decision. I'm going to try to cover a pretty broad basis today and do some high level stuff as well as a little bit kind of like semi deep dive stuff. And hopefully at the end of it, it'll be helpful for you guys to get an idea of the framework and some of the pieces that are part of it. So here's the agenda. We'll go over all the parts. So this is going to be kind of all the moving parts associated with building a component, deploying it, getting it working in UI Builder. We'll do a framework overview. I'm going to do a bunch of live coding and try to build some components, and then we're going to upload that into UI Builder. So the parts that we're going to be covering today is the command line interface, the ServiceNow command line interface, also known as the SNC CLI, the UI framework, which we'll spend most of our time on, and then UI Builder, which we'll spend some time on as far as getting our component into there and then interacting with it a little bit. So the SNC command line interface. So this, and I can provide maybe an email or sort of a resource at the end that has links to all the things I'm going to go over the day. I found most of this on our customer documentation through some rigorous research. You have to dig for it a little bit, but it's there. So the command line interface is primarily going to be for connecting to a ServiceNow instance, project scaffolding, project development, and then deploying your project components to UI Builder. So the CLI is going to be the way that you interface with your ServiceNow instance. The UI framework. So this is what I had a part in building. It's progressed quite a bit, especially in the customer ecosystem that you guys are more exposed to. And so I guess I'll also preface it with, you guys are probably familiar a little bit more with our developer customer ecosystem than I am, being an internal developer, not primarily interfacing with you guys very often. So kind of the pieces to the framework, again, this is going to be just technical and kind of a dive into the framework itself. But we originally built it with web components in mind. So it's web component based with some pizzazz. So what is that pizzazz? We give you state management that's built in. So if you're familiar with other front-end frameworks like React or Angular or any really single page application nowadays, you're dealing with some sort of state management for your components and your application. So we kind of build that into the framework. The primary sort of like, I guess, mantra for building components and then building apps outside of your components is going to be actions or events up and props down. So this is similar to what you're going to hear in React land if you've ever developed React components. The idea is that you have components on the page and they're going to emit actions or emit events that's going to be handled by some other component, and then those components are going to do some state updating, and then it's just going to simply pass state down as props into nested components. Another interesting, I think, characteristic of the UI framework is that it has pluggable renderers. And so we found this initially where one of the problems that we were trying to solve was just front-end technology churn. So you guys are familiar, as front-end devs, there's new technologies and stuff quite a bit. So we wanted to be able to make the render piece of our framework pluggable. So right now we currently use SnapDOM as our virtual DOM library as well, and then JSX on top of that. So it's going to give you kind of a React flavor as you're developing these components, seismic components. But we've had our internal teams have built D3 renders underneath the hood so that you can actually do data visualizations using the same seismic components. And the really power is here is we just kind of have an API contract that if you meet that contract, you can really build anything under the hood that you want. And customers can do that as well. I've worked with some third-party partners of ServiceNow to help develop taking old technologies, whether it was Angular components that they have in the App Store, and then wrapping them in a seismic component with the render, and then producing a seismic component that can render in a seismic application, which is kind of cool. Favors kind of a declarative model of programming. So this is one of the things that we needed to solve, was being able to have like a builder experience stamp out these web components and then be able to change their behavior at runtime as they're stamping out markup. We also do that through selectable properties, and this is how, as you're stamping out markup and serving markup, you can configure properties to be bound dynamically in the markup. So we'll go into some of that. A lot of this is maybe a fire hose, but we'll kind of dive into various aspects of that. So here's the API. So this is essentially what it looks like to create a seismic component if you've never done one. We have the UI core, which is what you're going to install and import for your package, and then you get to create custom element function out of it, which is just going to create your web component, your framework component. SnapDOM is going to be imported as the default render. You just plug that into the create custom element options. And then you're going to see here we have things like styles, which is going to be just your styles for your component. That's going to ultimately get encapsulated when you ship your component. The properties, these are your property definitions. So this is your API to the world. This is how you define getting data into your web component. Action handlers, these are going to be these are basically event. Before we went to event, so you'll see action and event handlers. Before we added event handlers, action handlers are your primary way for handling actions flowing up through the DOM and building a function to handle that and then do something as a result. So really just event handlers. Event handlers were built later to really help us just consume native events, so native DOM events like clicks and things like that. And so if you don't want to, and we'll get in more to the event model or the action model within Seismic, but you can also write event handlers for native DOM events. Transform state is just a way for you to process state before it ends up in your component view. We'll see that in a minute. Initial state is kind of preloading or priming your component with some initial state. And behaviors, we won't really touch on that today, but it's a way for you to build reusable behavior to share and use on multiple components. And then the second thing in there is the view, and this is going to be where you write a function that essentially returns JSX that'll end up as your DOM. So here's kind of the life cycle, just a high-level overview. You'll see you have the DOM there. It starts out, you have the DOM, you have some user interaction. User interacts with your component. Your component dispatches an action, and it gets handled by an action handler. And that action handler can either update state or it can dispatch another action, and it can handle that action indefinitely. This is helpful for asynchronous action handling, such as making an HTTP request from some user interaction and then handling that, fetching the data, and we'll get into that a little bit so you can see how that's handled. It'll update the component state. It'll go through a little process of evaluating properties. It'll run your transform state, which ultimately ends up in your view, which is just a function of state and your properties. And then you get some helpers in there as well, such as dispatch and a couple other things. So we'll look at that more when we dive into the code. The UI builder, again, this isn't really my expertise, but at a high level, if you guys have been exposed to it at all, it's really our application builder experience, right? So you can build applications. It handles building pages, laying out your pages, laying out your components, handles routing, so you can set up route parameters and use those route parameters to change behavior on the page. It's your shared component library, so you get a toolbox of all the shared components that you've built and then other people have built to use for your application building. And then kind of the guts of it is it kind of manages context, state, events, and data transformations, anything that makes an application meaningful. So as you're building something, you're thinking, where am I going to store this variable? How am I going to emit an event from this component that I built and make it interact with some other component on the page that I may have built or maybe I didn't build? my payload on this event is different than the input on this component. So how do I get them wired together? I need to transform that data to, conform to an API of another component. So UI Builder is really the setting that all that kind of happens. And we're going to cover some of that today, but it's pretty extensive and pretty complex. So we'll go into it a little bit. And what I don't cover today, again, there's some videos out there that I can follow up and send out. So now we'll just go ahead and dive in and build something. And I guess I'll pause for a second to see if there's any questions before I dive into just writing some code. The question for those who couldn't hear was kind of elaborate on what distinguishes a UI framework web component with just a raw web component. Is that right? Yeah, so it kind of goes back to all the stuff we add on top of it, right? Like we expanded on the native DOM events and added actions. And then we kind of have our own handling model, action handling model that provides some useful tools that of things that you want to do in a standard web application for out of the box things like handling HTTP requests without having to pull in a third-party library, managing state without having to pull in a third-party state management system. And so really it's just that kind of stuff added on top of web components. And then all of that is utilized within UI Builder and sort of wired together and abstracted to give you an app builder experience. Is that helpful? What was the question online?
Can you expand on what you meant by behaviors? You said they were reusable, but what types of things do they encompass?
Yeah, good question. So I'll go back a couple slides. So anything here, so properties of behavior essentially looks like a component definition minus a few things. So when you create a behavior, it's gonna be an object that contains properties, action handlers, maybe state and trying to think, initial state, transform state, event handlers. All those things are things that you can create and styles inside of a behavior. So one of the things that our design system team within ServiceNow has built is a right to left and left to right text styling thing. So you can behavior. So you can apply the right to left or the left to right behavior, and you just register it under the behaviors array when configuring this component. And then that's going to add some properties that when you set those properties, the behavior is going to handle all the styling and all the positioning for reversing the text for different non-English, or I guess whatever languages that you need to go. And either right to left.
Cool. Thank you.
Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Cool. So with that, we'll kind of dive in here. So if you remember, I already preset some of this up because it takes quite a long time to get running, especially with the npm install. So really all that I've ran right now is I've done two things. I've installed the CLI. I've connected it to a demo instance that we're going to look at today. And I have scaffolded a component for our project here, and I haven't really done anything to it after that. And then I've also so I ran SNC UI component project. So this is just going to create a project for me with the name of @Acme and then /color components, and it's going to give me a bunch of files and everything I need to package up and ship as a component. And before this, I did SNC. I forget I had it posted, but the configure profile set. So here you just register your instance and your username and password, and then it sets it in your profile. And then you run the project that'll scaffold it, and then you run develop on it, which will give you a development server that as you change things, it'll hot load and you can see it in your browser. And then deploy, which is going to deploy it to your instance. Just for the sake of time, we'll kind of dive in because some of this stuff takes a little while. And there's a bug that we'll have to work around today, but I'll call it out when we get to that point. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to set up, we're going to build two components that we're going to publish to UI Builder to use. Those two components are going to be very simple. One of those is going to be a color picker, a simple color picker. And then the second component is just going to be a text component that has two properties on it, text and color. And so depending on what you pass into your text component, it's going to display that text and it's going to style it the color that you give it. And then we're going to show in UI Builder how I can select a color on one component and then update the properties on the other component to make it work. We're also going to tie it into a list component that's already on UI Builder on the platform to wire it into a component that we didn't build, just to see how that's done. So I'm just going to go ahead and start writing code here. You'll notice I have a call to create custom element. I have this kind of scaffolded out project that gives me source, gives me a component folder, and it gives me an index file and then a style with a import of the SaaS kit, which is some theming stuff that we won't use today. So here in the index, I'm actually just going to rename this just for clarity's sake. We're going to do SN color picker. So we're going to make this our color picker component. So this is going to be what my web component tag is. Can everybody see that okay? Cool. Render snap DOM, this is standard. You can actually remove that and you get a default render, but this is just for being explicit sake. Here, I'm just going to write test, and then we're actually going to try to open this up. So I just need the command here, which is going to be SNC UI component develop. This is going to open it for me on port 3001. And hopefully this works. And what it's going to do is you have an example folder here in your project with element.js. And then your dev server is going to pick this up and it's going to import your component. It's going to shove that component into the inner HTML and serve this on a dev server. So here it opened up my browser. See what's going on here. Compiled successfully. I need to update this. Instead of color component, it's going to be color picker test. So we know it's working now. So this is our development server. So now as we change code, we can see it happening live. Let's go back in and start building out this component. So the first thing we're going to do is add, this is going to be our color picker. So let's go ahead and throw some inputs in here. Make this red. Color, value, red. I'll throw in a label for red. I didn't like that. Perfect. Perfect. Now we got red. Let's go ahead and throw this. Make this green. And blue. So now we have a sweet color picker. This is ready to ship already. So now that we got this, we're gonna go ahead and move on to our second component real quick, just to get that ready. We'll call this SN color text. Inside here, we'll go and change this to SN color text. And this is just going to render some properties that's given into it. So remember, we wanted two properties on this. So this is how you register properties on a component. So we're going to give it text And you can also configure some things on here like type string. I think it's actually schema, but you can configure some things on that. But for now, we don't need anything. So we're just going to use text, and then we're going to use color. So now up here, inside of state, this is the state that's passed into your view for rendering. So one of the properties that you're going to have on state is actually properties. So we're going to destructure that and just go ahead and pull properties out of the state. And we're also just going to go ahead and destructure that and pull the property text out as well. And then we'll just default it to an empty string if it doesn't exist. And then here we're just going to render this like you would in React. It's JSX. So if you're familiar with JSX, if you're not familiar with JSX, you'll have to. That'll be one sort of part of the learning curve. So looks good. We have SN color text. Let's go add that to our inner HTML here, just so we can see it. Import it here. So let's add just to test it out. So there, we got a web component now that's in the HTML, passing a text, and it's getting rendered on the page right here as test. Now let's test out the color property. Blue, that doesn't do anything. So now we got to make that do something. Now in here, we'll just add to this a style. Again, just JSX, and we'll say color equals color. We'll pull color out of the properties, and we'll default that to, how about orange? Yeah, so a style object within JSX, the style actually takes a object. So this is a key value object here. So you're giving it a key value pairs of yeah, camel case. Yeah. So like background color would be, background color. My IDE is throwing that in there. I use WebStorm. Most people use VS Code, but yeah, so that's my IDE. So it's not picking up orange, it's picking up blue because I added it over here as blue. If I get rid of that property being passed in, save that, it'll be orange. So we can get rid of. So now we'll go back to the color picker. One of the things that we want to do inside of color picker is, so if you think about how this component's going to interact with things on a page, we need to think about what is our API. So our API is two ways, right? It's our events that we emit, our actions that we event to the world. It's also the properties that we take in. So the way that actions work within the UI framework is they propagate up through the DOM. So it is hierarchical. So it's going to go through, is going to bubble up the DOM, and you have there are APIs within Seismic that allow you to stop that propagation, similar to how there is in native DOM elements. So for now, what I'm going to do is I could do this a number of ways. So one of the things with the UI framework is there's usually about at least 20 different ways to do something. And so I'm just picking one way. And whether or not that is a good aspect of the framework is arguable, but it's kind of the reality. And so I'm going to cover one of the ways, but just know that as I do things, there are multiple best practices depending on what you're trying to do. And then sometimes there is no best practice. It doesn't matter. You just pick one. As far as this goes, one of the things I want to do is I need to capture inside of my web component if one of these inputs are selected. I want to dispatch an event to the outside world and say, like, something changed within my component. So I could do that a couple of ways. I could do an action handler here, and then I could write on each one of these lines for my input. I could write like an on input, and then here I could write a little function that says dispatch is one of the helpers that you get in your state. And dispatch is our event emitting function within the framework. So I get state, and then I get this little helpers object. There's dispatch, there's update state, and I think update properties. So we're not going to update state right now. We can either dispatch an event. So here I could say like dispatch some action. Or if I don't want to do a dispatch on each one of these lines, what I'm actually going to do is, instead of action handlers, I'm going to write an event handler. And I always forget this syntax, so I put it in a scratch in here. So this is going to be our event handlers. So our event handlers is an array of event handlers. It has an events property on it, and here is just specifying the events that you want to respond to. So depending on the events you want to capture within your web component, throw your events in here that you want to capture. Effect, this is going to be the function that gets executed when your event is handled or when your action is handled. So if you're writing action handlers, you're going to do the same thing. Here it's going to be some action that was emitted, and then here you're going to have, a function, some effect. We call these effects within the UI framework. Some of you may be familiar with sort of a more functional model of programming. It's not terribly important if you don't, but one of the models we try to follow is reducing the amount of side effects that happen within your view code. And so the overarching goal for some of these paradigms is testability, so that you can write views that can be testable by snapshot test or however you want to run your testing for your web component. And then your event handlers are just functions that are going to, in some cases, they're pure functions that don't have any side effects, that just produce a result. But in our case, the effect functions are going to be doing things that are side effectful to your application, such as HTTP requests, updating state. And some of this language may be unfamiliar to you. Again, it's just part of the learning curve, and there is documentation around this paradigm in the UI framework docs on the developer site, so I can point you to that as well. But hopefully I don't lose you in all the lingo. But the overall idea is you're going to write a handler for these events or these actions. And so we'll get rid of this for now. So in here, I'm going to dispatch an event, SN color picker value set. Because these are web components, you do have a shadow DOM aspect. And so when you get the event out of the payload for the events that get emitted when you change this input, it's going to return to you the target node in your event is actually going to be your web component, because it doesn't expose your shadow DOM markup. So you can kind of get around that by diving into the path. So we add the path property to the event that'll show you the actual path down through your shadow DOM to pull the value out of the original. So we're grabbing the first element out of the path, which will be the target element, which is going to ultimately give us our input, our radio input.
So Darren, if we picked the second element, that would be the label.
The second element would be the div here. It's the DOM hierarchy.
Okay, cool.
Yep. So the question in the room was, go over line 30. So again, effect here is just a function, right? I get some things passed in. I get a big object called co-effects. And again, we'll kind of skip over the lingo for now, but the idea is this is your function execution context. So it gives you a bunch of things surrounding handling this event. So if I wanted to, all I'm doing here is grabbing some properties off of this object. I'm grabbing a dispatch, which is a function. I'm grabbing the action, which is the action that got emitted from my input. I'm grabbing the payload off of that action. And then part of that payload is the event that got attached to it. So now I have a native DOM event right here. And so now I'm just grabbing the first element out of the path of that event and grabbing the value off of that, which is going to give me this input value depending on which one I selected. Event is the DOM event. Yeah, so if I do console.log event, we go back over here, open up our developer console. So you can see I'm logging events here. These are just DOM events, cancelable, bubble, current target. You'll notice that the target element is the color picker and not the input itself. This is why we dig into the path, and you'll see the path here, the input. This is our input that we actually clicked on. It'll take you to it. So now that we have that, really what we want to grab is the value off of that, and then we want to make that the payload of the action that our component is dispatching. And so, like I said, there's two sort of aspects to building this out, right? Is the concepts are you're building a component, which is the UI framework. The second piece of that is you're making it work inside of UI Builder. The UI framework is the seismic, that's the component we're building. UI Builder is all about the now UI JSON and what you put in that file. So your project scaffolds that out. When you scaffold your project, it gives you a now UI JSON. So here is kind of what it scaffolded. We're going to replace this with something meaningful for us. And I'm going to go and grab that off of here. If you have, again, if I'm hearing your question correctly, you have a component and you kind of have sort of two ways you want to use that component. One way is you just want to listen to events and do something else somewhere on the page. And the second way is you want to actually control that component. So if you want to pass like the selected color in. So right now I'm just dispatching up an action with a value. That's going to get used somewhere to probably update some state and get used in some way. But what if I want to take that state value as some higher level component and pass that back into my color picker so that it controls what that color picker selected, right? You can do that. You would just add a property, and then you sort of have to make it the way that we've done that internally is we have components that are managed and non-managed, and you can kind of pick the mode. So if you choose to manage it yourself, it'll just fire and forget events and it won't keep track of state. It's only whatever you pass into it. Or you can write it in such a way to where it controls its own state internally, and no matter what you pass into it as props, it doesn't matter. It's managing its own internal state. So depending on your use case, you can make both. The Now UI JSON is going to be our primary way to interface with UI Builder. So what we define in the Now UI JSON is direct, as I deploy this application, the deployment process is going to go through this file, and it's going to create a bunch of system records for your ServiceNow instance, just table entries that expose it to UI Builder, right? We won't go over what all those records are, but that's all this is doing. So we're adding some metadata to a file that's going to get scraped, and some records are going to be produced, and those records are going to be inserted into the platform. And then UI Builder is going to look at those tables, pull those records, and use them however we use them. So that's what the Now UI JSON is. So you'll see here I have the SNC color picker. So this is one of our components. I'm defining an action for it. So this is telling UI Builder, when I show this in my component toolbox, I need to somehow expose to whoever's using my component that I need to, that I can configure and do something as a result of this action. This is going to be some metadata about my component for display in the toolbox purposes, ideally, or like the name of the component, the label, the icon that it uses, the description, our top-notch color picker. We have the demo component, which is not correct. This is going to be our color text. And it's our color text, and it's our text components. we have 2 properties associated with this component. So this is going to let UI Builder know that it has properties that can be wired and bound to it within UI Builder. I have text and I have color. So right now there's this sort of disconnected development process where you define some properties and actions on a framework component, but then you have to go and kind of redo it all in the Now UI JSON so that the platform can actually know, because we don't do any static analysis on your code to say, this is what your actions are, this is what your props are. Right now, you have to declare that in your Now UI JSON. Fingers crossed, somewhere down the road, maybe some static analysis tools that we'll be able to scrape and pull this for you so that you can kind of not have to declare this stuff twice. But for now, this is the world we live in. So I'm going to save that. So right now I'm running my development server. I'm going to cancel this out. I'm going to run my deployment command. Let's see. So this is SNC UI component deploy. And force, this is just going to, when I do subsequent deployments, this is just going to overwrite the existing records in there with my updated records. There's no version management around this right now, from what I could understand. I learned a lot of this for the first time preparing for this demo. So there's definitely some gaps in my knowledge. But for now, you have to kind of blow away what you did before and then upload your new component as you're developing it. So a lot of this demo is just centered around our development cycle for like getting things working, not necessarily like production ready, shipping this as a product. So here you'll see, you can tell what it's doing. It's creating these records, source script record, lib component, macro component, toolbox component. So you'll see it each, it's basically these 2 things twice for each of the components that I have defined inside of my Now UI JSON. It says it was successful. So let's check it out. If I try to run that again without force, even though I didn't make any changes, it might just fail. Yeah, already contains sync component records. So that's why force is necessary right now for subsequent deployments. Let's log into my demo instance here. So this is UI Builder, and if you guys haven't seen it before, here it is. There's a lot of things I'm going to gloss over just for the sake of time and kind of purpose of this demo. But this is UI Builder. I'm piggybacking off of an existing some existing templates that already exist there. But one thing I did do is I just created a test page, which started out as a blank page, and I just added one component to it, which is a list. So here you'll see I selected on the body, I selected the 2-column layout over here on the right, which gave me column 1 and column 2. And then to column 1, I just added this list component by simply clicking on column 1 and adding component. And then here, this is your component toolbox. So this is all the components that are on the platform plus anything that you add in there. And then, so I added a list and I configured it a little bit with pointing it at it's pointed at the task table. And it's just a standard list component. It has its own configuration options, but what we're interested in is adding our components and then making them interact with each other. So we're going to add a component here, and I'm going to search for my components. So what were they called? Let's see. Oh, I need to refresh this. That's why. I'll try to breeze through this with 10 minutes left. See if we can get all the way there. All right. So we're going to add a component. Here's my Acme color picker, my Acme colored text. So I'm just going to add the colored picker. And then I'm also going to add right below it another component, which is my colored text. And it doesn't have anything in it. But if I go in here and do test in blue, that should work. I'm going to save this page. That doesn't look like it's working. So we'll figure that out in a minute. So what I want to do, so now I have kind of these three different components on the page, and I'm just going to make them all interact in some sort of manufactured way, right? So one of the things that I want to do is when I click on one of these rows in the list, I just want to update my text in the text field. So I'm going to go over here. Again, skipping over a lot, but there's this down here in the bottom left. You're going to see data, client state, and then some client scripts. So I'm going to click on client state, and this is a way for me to just add sort of a grab bag of key value state objects to my page context for all the components on the page to share and use and reference when we're doing data binding. So I added text in here, and I added color. And I added some initial value for the text and then initial value for the color. So now what I want to do is go back over to my color text component. And in text, I'm going to add data binding for state. So these are just, this will auto populate for you for everything available on your state, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to put text, and then I'm going to do grab state.color.
Talk about the mechanism it's using to do binding.
You mean like the gritty details? So I mean, basically what's happening is when UX Builder goes to build a page, all your dependencies are known. And so it's kind of like NPM. It looks at your registry for all the components on your page. It goes to the tables associated with those records. It pulls all of those in, and then it renders your page markup based off of that. But then another thing that it does is it also keeps records, and it keeps track for this sort of DSL, which is at state.text. There's other tables that map these bindings to whatever component you're binding them to, right? And as they're rendering the page, and as this page at runtime gets rendered, it's a lot of updating state calls with container components. So there's this concept called macro component, which is it's just a sort of a higher order component that wraps all the components that you build, and other people build. So every component you build gets wrapped when it makes its way into UI Builder. You get some magic with that wrapping, right? The high order component. It does some things like, and the whole app itself gets one of those as well. And so as you bind these, it's going to update state at the higher order component level, and then it's going to keep track of your state on all the things that you're binding to, and then it's going to pass them in as selectable properties to the different components. You can build single page applications in the context of UI Builder. So yeah, as you're changing views, and views are changing, and you have tab components, that's details versus list views and all that state's going to be maintained. But yeah, it's a single page application. If you're talking about two entirely different pages, yeah. So yes, you can put state at top level that gets, and a lot of that's done through routing and your URL parameters as well, so that you can navigate back and forth through that state, right? Let me figure out real quick why this isn't working. So color state, SN color text. Let's see. Color text takes a property. So right now I'm binding these values, but they're not showing up. So then I can hit this little preview button, and it's going to open up my page here. There's my list, and here's my components. I'm just going to go inspect this. So here's my color picker, and here's my SN color text. Looks like it's missing. SNC color text, SNC color text. Now UI. Oh, I need to add it to here. So my module is not actually exporting the. So here, let's deploy that again. So I just had this component. It wasn't getting packaged with my source code. So my source code, when it looks for the index, it was only pulling in one component. So the source code for my other component wasn't there, which is why my shadow DOM was empty for. You'll notice here, S&C color picker has a shadow root, but this one doesn't. It's because my web component code didn't get ran because I didn't package it. So deploy successful. Let's go back over here and refresh. And now we should see some magic.
Are there any CSS frameworks that come preloaded with the seismic framework?
Just our design system. So still not working. Oh, I think my now UI JSON is messed up. 1 second. I'll answer that as soon as I get this fixed. Actions. Interesting. All right, let's try this. So there's a bug right now in the CLI where it doesn't pick up on the actions defined in the for the component in the now UI JSON. And so we're gonna have to work around that anyway. And I was gonna show you sort of how we get that done. Are we good if we go a couple minutes over? You guys fine with that? We can end it, or if we want to see this working. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. I didn't time this out, so. There we go. Okay, so now our text is in there, right? And you'll see that it says default text is pretty boring. The reason that's there is because it's our initial value. So if I do, test, that's going to switch to test in there. So now we got that working. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire this list up. So as I pick an item, it updates my text. So this is where you click on the list. So we select our list component. We go over to events. Has a bunch of things associated with it. One of the things that we're going to do is click on, so you just add a new event handler. And this is a list of out-of-the-box events for UI Builder. But I already made one here. We're just going to edit it. And there's an event called update client state parameter. So the state parameter is going to be our text. And then this is a little bit of magic, but I can grab the payload.row and then actually let me look. So this is before I was console logging when I clicked so that I could see where my the data that I want is. But I just want to grab this display value off of this event object. So this is the payload is the event object from the list because remember I'm configuring an event handler for the list. This is the payload of that event, and then everything kind of after that is a part of that payload. And this all that was defined with whoever built the list component. they got to decide that payload.row exists and that row display value existed. So that's where that comes from. And ideally, there would be some mechanism to make that more discoverable. But for now, we'll do that. We'll save it. We'll go back over here and refresh, see if we got that working. So now when I click on a row, I should see it updating that state if we're lucky. Didn't work. So let's go see what's going on. Text. Looks like it didn't get saved. Payload.row. That value. Apply. Save. Oh, there it goes. It was working. Okay, so now you can see when I'm clicking on these, it's actually updating that text over here. So now what we're going to do is go and wire up our color picker, and so that we can actually use that to change the color. So we'll have 3 different components interacting. So here's the bug. And I had to like do a bunch of research, figure out how this actually works. But right now, since the events that show up in this list here on your right would be picked up by the Now UI JSON, but since it's not, we're going to do some magic and actually go define these in the platform. So this is the 6th UX event table is where these actions are actually getting defined for UI Builder. So I'm going to go and create a new action here. My label is going to be color picker value set, and I'm going to name that SNC color picker namespace that, and then just say value set. And I'm going to save this. So I mentioned that there's a sort of a higher order component associated with each component within UI Framework. We're going to go look at that table now. It's called the SysUX macroponent table. So now I'm just going to go search for my components. So here's my color picker, here's my text. This is how events actually get tied to your component. Edit that in scope. Dispatched events, this is where that gets ultimately registered. So here, if I just search for color picker, you'll see color picker value set. So I'm just going to pick that event and then save this. So that's sort of the magic that we're doing right now. So I'm going to refresh this, and we should see that event associated with our color picker now. So now I click on that, I go over to events, and they're not there. So let's go back and make sure. Yeah, I saw that. And I don't know if that actually conflicts. So let's go try that. Let's just see if we can delete this one. So now we'll go back into here, remove this guy. Save, refresh this. I think UI Builder doesn't know how to handle conflicting event registration. So let's try this again. Color picker value set. Save that. Go back and refresh. Go select my color picker, events. Did I pick the right one? Oh, no, I didn't. I'm on color text. So there you go. User error. It was probably right the whole time, and I was blaming other people. So we want the color picker. Edit this. Thanks for hanging with me, guys. Color value set. We'll save this. So now when I click this, click events, color picker value set. So now I just want to add a handler for that. And we're going to do the same thing that we did with the list. And I'm going to update client state parameter. And I'm going to pick color. And I'm going to take, so if you remember, if we go back and look at our code, inside of the color picker, the event gets dispatched, and this is the payload that's going to get dispatched in there. So that's what we're handling, right? So if I do at payload dot value, this is going to map to the value property that we set in our event here. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to save that. And then we'll go back over here to our application. So I'm going to click these. So that's changing that. And now if I click red, green, blue, it's actually changing the color now. So that's just demonstrating that we can, we can create a component, we can create some events that get dispatched, we can handle those. This is how we pick them up inside of UI Builder and sort of map them all together. Again, there's a innumerable number of ways to sort of build applications and make all these interact, but hopefully this gives you guys some context for being able to get started, or at least know where to look. And then that's all I have for today. Any questions?